Rain had already entered her sleeves by the time Susan Erickson stepped down from the public coach at Bond Street, and the wet wool of her gloves clung to her fingers like skin that did not belong to her. She landed badly, one shoe sliding in slush, 2 hat boxes knocking against her knees, while gentlemen in dark coats and ladies beneath polished parasols glanced once and then away. Mrs. Erickson stood at the curb under the only umbrella, its black silk angled to protect her own hat and feathers, and did not look back when she said, "Do not dawdle, girl. If you drop those boxes, you will pay for them with your supper." Susan shifted the ribbon handles deeper into her palms and followed through the press of wheels, hooves, and shouted directions, her thin shawl darkening by the second. Cold water found the gap at her collar and travelled down her spine in a narrow, patient line. Her heels had blistered yesterday, then opened this morning on the walk to the coach stand, and now each step pressed fire and ice together. She kept her jaw still. She kept her shoulders level. The hat boxes had to remain dry. That mattered more than her hands, more than the ache in her stomach that sharpened each time a bakery door opened and warm yeast drifted into the street before being cut away by sleet. Outside Madame Verville's modiste rooms, Susan stood while Mrs. Erickson disappeared into candles, mirrors, and layered silk. The window glass threw back a pale, narrow face with wind-reddened cheeks, dark hair pinned in haste, and eyes that looked larger when she had not eaten. People passed in pairs. A boy with newspapers slowed to stare at her shoes, at the seam gone white where stitching had frayed. 2 young women in fur muffs looked from her to the painted mannequins and lowered their voices without lowering them enough. Susan didn't move. She held the hat boxes against her skirt and watched steam fog and clear the lower pane each time the shop door opened. Inside she could see Mrs. Erickson lift bolts of rose and silver and hold them toward the light. She could hear her too, because she wanted to be heard. "Not that shade. I am not dressing a maid. Plain girls must learn obedience if they mean to earn their bread." Laughter followed. Not cruel laughter in tone. Worse. Casual laughter, as if the sentence were weather and no more avoidable than rain. Susan kept her gaze on the brass latch and counted backwards from 100, then again. She flexed her fingers against the handles to stop their trembling. Hunger had narrowed her hands over these last months, until each knuckle showed like a small stone beneath skin. She hid them by gripping harder. When at last Mrs. Erickson returned, perfumed in lavender and dry from hat to hem, she gave Susan a brief look of disapproval and said, "You are shivering. Stand straighter. People are watching." People were always watching when humiliation could be mistaken for order. A footman from a neighbouring carriage smirked as Mrs. Erickson passed him the parcel account to settle, and gestured toward Susan as one might gesture toward hired transport. A gentleman offered Mrs. Erickson his arm to cross a muddy stretch, and did not include the girl carrying the boxes behind her. Susan crossed alone, skirts lifted just enough to keep them from the worst of the wheel ruts. Mud splashed anyway. One drop struck her cheek. Another darkened the cuff she had mended twice by candlelight, with thread pulled from an older hem. By the second week of November, London rain had begun to smell of coal before noon, and even the expensive avenues wore a film of soot over stone. The coach ride home felt longer because she was cold through every layer. Mrs. Erickson kept the umbrella open until they reached their own step, then gave it to the maid and instructed that Susan carry the purchases to the blue dressing room before she changed. Susan climbed the stairs without pausing, breath shallow to quiet the stitch under her ribs. On the landing she passed a mirror framed in gilt that had belonged to her father's sister, and for one moment she saw her own reflection beside the stacked hat boxes, and thought what strangers must see. A narrow-shouldered young woman in a dress gone thin at elbows and hem. No hat worth noting, no ring, no chaperone of affection, only utility. She looked like an afterthought left in the rain. The litany of how she had come there moved through her in the same order each day, not because she cherished misery, but because accuracy was the only dignity left to guard. Her father dead 3 winters. A fever first, then lungs that never recovered. Ledgers from his shipping office mislaid before probate and never found, though she had searched every cabinet and crate until splinters lodged beneath both thumbnails. Creditors arriving with soft voices and hard documents. The townhouse deed signed under debt pressure she had not been permitted to witness in full. Her mother long gone, no face she could summon with certainty, only the memory of a lullaby with words she could no longer place. Mrs. Erikson entering the house in lavender silk as wife, and remaining in it as master after the funeral black was folded away. Firewood to the attic rationed by week. Meals withheld for imagined insolence. New locks on cabinets that had once stood open. Her father's books removed from his study shelf by shelf until only decorative spines remained, blank paper wrapped in calfskin for show. Susan had watched the transformation without the luxury of disbelief. Houses did not change by accident. Names did not slide from ownership to dependence by weather. Paper did that. Ink did that. Signatures did that. She had learned early to fear the quiet scratch of a nib more than raised voices. It was also paper that kept one narrow door open. Her father had taught her pen discipline when she was 10, sitting beside her in the office behind the warehouse while rain struck the panes and clerks argued over tonnage. "Language is a ledger," he had told her, pressing her hand to slow the downward stroke. "If you keep it clean, men with titles cannot pretend they do not owe what they owe." She had held that sentence like contraband ever since. At night, when the house settled and even the restless boards outside the attic ceased their complaints, she lit a candle stub in a chipped saucer and copied notices for 2 solicitors who paid in coins folded inside legal wrappers. She wrote leases, petitions, debt acknowledgements, witness statements, inventories from estate auctions where old lives were reduced to columns and sums. Her script was exact. Her spacing did not drift. Names remained legible even when ink thinned. The work left a ridge at the base of her middle finger and a constant soreness in her neck, but it bought soap, lamp oil, and, on rare weeks, a heel of bread she ate in 2 measured halves to make relief last. Mrs. Erikson believed Susan mended linens after dark. If she had known about the copying, she would have called it deceit and confiscated the coins in the name of household order. Susan hid them instead in a hollow behind a loose attic brick wrapped in waxed cloth. She had never stolen from the household. She had only preserved what little of herself had not yet been requisitioned. When they returned from Bond Street, the lower hall smelled of beeswax and damp wool. The cook's maid passed, carrying onions, and did not meet Susan's eyes, though a folded crust appeared later beside the scullery basin, where no one would claim to have left it. Small kindnesses came like that in houses ruled by fear, without witness, without language, too brief to trust but too precise to mistake. Susan delivered the boxes, unwrapped tissue, set pins where instructed, and stood while Mrs. Erikson discussed supper placements with Mrs. Dalrymple, who had arrived in dove-grey silk and pearls. "Place Miss Erikson where she can be useful and quiet," Mrs. Erikson said, adjusting a ribbon against the mirror. "Near the sideboard, perhaps. If she is required to read, she reads clearly enough. It is the one ornamental talent she possesses." Mrs. Dalrymple gave Susan a glance that measured posture and dress and ancestry in one sweep, then looked through her as if she had already been seated among the footmen. Susan lowered her eyes because open defiance cost more than it paid, but inside she marked each word with the same care she gave to legal copy. Useful, quiet, ornamental. She carried them upstairs with the hatbox tissue and set them down in memory's neat hand, where they would remain unaltered by later denials. Dusk entered early. The rain thickened against the drawing-room panes until the street lamps blurred into amber smears. Susan laid the fire herself because the second footman had been sent on an errand and the first was opening wine. She knelt on the hearthrug and stacked kindling with fingers still wrinkled from wet gloves, then fed in 2 larger logs and watched smoke hesitate before the chimney took it. Heat struck her face while her back stayed cold. She rose to set cups, count spoons, trim wicks, and straighten the pile of correspondence placed on the side table for after-dinner amusement. One envelope bore a seal in dark wax she did not immediately know, pressed with a crest, partly smudged where rain had touched it. She turned it once to dry the edge near the grate and set it atop the stack. From the corridor came the rustle of expensive skirts, the low hum of arriving voices, the clink of carriage steps outside as more guests reached the door. Susan smoothed her cuffs and moved to her assigned place near the sideboard, half in light, half out of it, prepared to pour, to fetch, to disappear on command while her empty stomach tightened and released like a small fist beneath her ribs. The bell rang again. Mrs. Erikson entered in lavender silk, smiling with all her teeth, and held out her hand for the evening's letters. Susan placed the stack on Mrs. Erikson's open palm in the order she had sorted them, invitations first, tradesmen's accounts beneath, private letters last, and the simple act sent an old hurt through her chest, because her father had once trusted her with the household post as if it were a lesson in stewardship rather than servitude. The drawing-room filled in layers around her. Wet greatcoats left on hooks in the hall. Candle smoke warming near the plaster roses overhead. Damp hems steaming before the fire. Mrs. Dalrymple took the chair nearest the grate, as if rank had assigned it at birth. 2 officers stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the portrait of Susan's grandfather, and spoke of horses with the smooth ease of men who never had to calculate the price of coal. Mrs. Erikson remained at the centre, lavender silk rustling each time she turned, reading names on envelopes as though she were auditing guests at her own court. Susan moved between table and sideboard, poured wine, replaced a spoon dropped by a gloved hand, and absorbed the room's studied inattention, as she had learned to absorb winter wind, by letting it pass through flesh while keeping one still point untouched. That still point had once been her father's voice across an oak desk, low and exact, saying that property was duty before it was privilege, that a house was not walls, but obligations entered and honoured. He had remarried when creditors began to circle in earnest, years after the fever took Susan's mother so early that memory held only fragments, and the woman he married arrived with connections, polished manners, and a promise that her dowry would calm every alarm. Susan had been 17 and naive enough to mistake composure for kindness. She remembered the first supper after the wedding. Mrs. Erikson had placed her own daughters, Eloise and Margot, on either side of Susan's father and asked, with practised lightness, whether the old portraits in the West Gallery might be moved, as they were so gloomy for girls. Within a fortnight the portraits were in storage. Within a month the music room was painted over in cream selected by Eloise. By autumn, Margot wore Susan's mother's pearl comb and claimed it had always been hers. Nothing had been seized in one dramatic theft. Everything had gone by permission, signature, suggestion, then decree. Susan's chamber shifted from the front floor to a smaller room near the attic because young ladies should not be indulged in excess space. Her new room had one narrow window and a latch that stuck in damp weather. Her father apologised once, standing awkwardly at the threshold with a ledger tucked beneath his arm, saying it would be temporary until accounts settled. He coughed twice before he finished the sentence. He died before the window was repaired. The debts that followed came in calls at the door and folded papers left by men who bowed while stripping a life to numbers. Mrs. Ericsson received them all with composed regret and announced each reduction as household prudence. One maid dismissed, then another. Silver sold, though only the marked pieces from Susan's mother's side disappeared first. Horses reduced from 4 to 2, then hired out. Firewood allocation revised. Sugar rationed. Ink locked. Susan learned that deprivation in respectable houses came wrapped in language that sounded like management. She learned, too, that Eloise and Margot could discover appetite in any object that had once belonged to her. The velvet mantle her father bought when she turned 16 appeared on Eloise by Christmastide, altered at the waist. Margot claimed the rosewood writing box from Susan's schoolroom and laughed when Susan asked for the brass key, saying a box was wasted on a girl who should be improving her temper rather than her script. Even the small dog from her childhood, old and half-blind, was sent to the stables because Margot said his breathing offended her sleep. He died there in January. Susan buried him at dawn with frozen fingers and no witness. At supper that night, Mrs. Ericsson discussed menu costs, while Eloise practised smiling into a spoon as though it were a mirror. The room now, bright with company and expensive perfume, had the same walls, the same carved cornice, the same mirror over the mantel, and yet she stood in it as an employed shadow while strangers praised the mistress for maintaining standards in difficult times. She crossed to refill glasses, and as she leaned to pour claret for a guest from Brook Street, she felt the pull of a bruise at her upper arm, where Mrs. Ericsson's fingers had closed that morning when a cuff was not pressed to satisfaction. The pain sharpened memory rather than blurring it. Her father's last winter had smelled of vinegar compresses and burned rosemary. He had still tried to work, wrapped in blankets, in the office downstairs, signing bills with a hand that shook only after the pen left paper. Susan sat beside him most evenings then, reading invoices aloud because breath failed him if he spoke too long. The numbers did not frighten her at first. Trade slowed after storms in the Channel. One cargo lost near Whitby. Insurance dispute pending. Delays, not catastrophe. Then one shipment vanished from the books entirely. Entries scratched out and rewritten in a clerk's hand she did not know. Her father stared at the altered line for so long she thought he had fallen asleep sitting up. "Keep copies," he told her at last. "Always keep copies." She did. She made duplicates at night for him, then for herself, folding them into the lining of an old valise. After the funeral she went to fetch them and found the valise gone. Mrs. Ericsson informed her that household clutter had been cleared for sanitation. When Susan asked who had authorised burning legal papers, Mrs. Ericsson slapped her for speaking above her station in front of servants. It was not a dramatic blow, not the sort that left a mark for days. It was worse for being efficient, almost administrative, delivered and forgotten by the hand that gave it. From that day forward, correction became routine. A pinch at the back of the arm in corridors where guests could not see. A strike across the shoulder with a fan if tea arrived tepid. Nails pressing into the wrist until skin rose red. Meals withdrawn not always for faults, but for weather in the house, for the mistress's headache, for Eloise's disappointment with a modiste, for Margot's boredom. Hunger became arithmetic, Could she buy bread with 2 of the coins from copying if lamp oil was due on Thursday? Could she stretch marrow soup from kitchen remnants if she added barley from her own hoard? Could she keep handwriting steady when fingers numbed after midnight? She did not cry where they could use it. Once, in late March, tears came uninvited while she scrubbed ink from a table leg after Margot overturned a bottle and blamed her. She wiped them at once with the heel of her hand and continued until the wood grain showed clean again. The servants noticed more than they admitted. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, never challenged Mrs. Erikson directly, but she began leaving mending in Susan's path that included thread stronger than what had been allocated upstairs. Cook sent broth left over on evenings when no broth had been served below stairs. The second footman, young and frightened of dismissal, whispered that strangers had asked after old shipping ledgers and been turned away. Susan carried each small fact, like tinder, waiting for a spark she could not predict. By the first week of October she had secured regular copying from Mr. Bell, solicitor on Chancery Lane, who discovered by chance that the anonymous hand delivering his fair copies could reproduce damaged entries from memory with frightening precision. He paid in shillings hidden between folded case notices, and never asked why she preferred not to sign her name. That money did not free her, but it preserved a sliver of autonomy. It bought salve for blisters. It bought a second-hand grammar of legal phrase she read beneath blankets by candlestub. It bought time, and time in a hostile house was a currency almost equal to bread. Tonight, standing 3 paces from Mrs. Erikson while guests admired the cut of lavender silk purchased with funds Susan could still trace on paper, she felt the full ledger of loss settle over her like damp wool. Father buried, mother barely a song, rooms reduced, property renamed, bruises hidden under sleeves, skills practiced in secret, stepsisters glittering in jewels drawn from the same coffers that denied her coal. The injustice was not one wound. It was accumulation, methodical as bookkeeping, each subtraction entered in ink no magistrate had yet agreed to read. Eloise arrived late, cheeks bright from cold and triumph, and kissed Mrs. Erikson on both sides, while Margot followed, carrying gossip as if it were a fan, snapping open and shut in whispers pitched to Carrie. "Lady Kettering said the Vale household is in turmoil again," Margot murmured, accepting a glass from Susan without thanks. "A guardian was dismissed. There is talk of a child with weak lungs." Mrs. Erikson gave a soft sound of interest and asked no direct question, which was her preferred method when she wished to harvest detail without appearing eager. Susan lowered the decanter, eyes on the tray, and moved away. She had no right to opinions in this room, yet language reached her regardless. Veil, guardianship, weak lungs, legal words disguised as gossip words. Across the carpet, Mrs. Dalrymple asked whether Susan might read after supper because "the girl has a reliable voice and we are all too languid for effort." Mrs. Erikson smiled. "If Miss Erikson can read, Miss Erikson can be useful." Eloise laughed behind her glove. Margot added, provided she does not embroider the text with sentiment. Their mockery landed in practised rhythm, an old duet worn smooth by repetition. Susan set fresh cups on the tea-table and aligned handles to the right as her father had taught her when she was small enough to stand on a stool. Accuracy was habit now, almost prayer. She counted guests by reflection in the mantel mirror. 11 seated, 4 standing, 2 servants at doors. Rain still striking windows in erratic bursts. The fire had settled to a low red bed and needed another log, but she waited for the proper interval because stepping forward at the wrong moment invited rebuke. Mrs. Erikson sorted the evening's post with deliberate fingers, setting aside cards and bills until only one envelope remained, the one with rain-softened wax, and the crest Susan had failed to identify near the grate. Mrs. Erikson turned it beneath the candle as if weighing amusement against risk, then looked towards Susan with an expression of bright cruelty so familiar it no longer surprised, only tightened the skin at the back of Susan's neck. "Come here," she said, extending the sealed letter between two rings heavy with stones that had once rested in her father's safe. "You may earn your keep. Read this aloud and entertain our friends. Let us hear what fortune writes, to plain obedience." Susan crossed the carpet with the room's attention. Following like cold water, she accepted the envelope, felt the thick quality of the paper, saw at last the ducal coronet pressed into the dark wax where rain had blurred one edge, and for a single suspended breath she understood that whatever words lay inside were about to be spoken in a house that had taught her the cost of every syllable. She slipped her thumb beneath the softened wax, and the seal broke with a small sound that carried farther than it should have in a room grown hungry for spectacle. The paper inside was heavy, expensive, the sort that did not come to houses in distress unless the sender meant to be obeyed. Candlelight trembled along the folded edge as she opened it. Her eyes were dry from smoke and the long day, and the first line reached her mouth before sense caught it. "Miss Erikson, I ask for your hand, because honour will not permit me to ask for less." The words struck the drawing-room like a dropped decanter. Glass did not shatter, but conversation did. Mrs. Dalrymple's fan stopped mid-motion. One of the officers lowered his glass without drinking. Eloise gave a quick breath of laughter that failed halfway out of her throat. Margot's painted smile sharpened, uncertain whether to mock or retreat. Susan heard her own pulse in her ears. She had read contracts that dissolved businesses and wills that split families, yet no sentence had ever left her feeling so abruptly exposed. She looked down again, willing the script to change under her gaze. It remained the same, a ducal hand controlled and spare, each stroke deliberate. The house, which had never been safe, now felt breached from within. Rain struck the windows in erratic bursts. In the hall, the front door opened. Boots met stone. A servant began to announce a name and faltered. The room turned toward the doorway as one body, every face lit by candle and curiosity, and Susan stood at the centre of their attention, with a marriage proposal open in both shaking hands. Mrs. Erikson recovered first because cruelty had trained her reflexes better than conscience ever had. Her laugh came bright and brittle. "How diverting! Read the signature, girl, so we may thank whichever clerk has mistaken your plain face for a profitable jest." Susan's throat tightened. She lowered her gaze to the final line. The signature had been blotted once by rain, then dried, but the name remained unmistakable. Alistair Thorne, Duke of Vale. Her fingers numbed. The Duke of Vale was not a man people invented for drawing-room amusement. He existed in legal notices, in parliamentary whispers, in the abrupt silence that followed his name at supper. Men said he had inherited too young and buried too many. Women said he had not smiled in public since his brother's death. Solicitors said he read every line before he signed and did not forgive errors. She heard the last of the footman's announcement at the threshold, thin with alarm. "His Grace, the Duke of Vale!" He entered with rain still dark on his greatcoat, tall enough that the doorway seemed made for lesser men, broad shoulders, dark hair damp at the temples, a face carved in decisive angles, too still to be called calm. His eyes found Susan at once, and did not leave her. She had the irrational sensation that the rest of the room receded by several feet, then farther, until only the letter and the man in the doorway remained in focus. Mrs. Erikson stepped forward with practised grace, lavender silk whispering at each movement. "Your Grace, what an unanticipated honour! I fear there has been a misunderstanding. My stepdaughter is inclined to dramatics. I asked her to read a harmless note and—" "Continue," the Duke said. "One word. Quiet. Final." It was not spoken to Mrs. Erikson. It landed on Susan like a command and a rescue bound together so tightly she could not separate them. She swallowed and obeyed because defiance had no shape available to her that would not end in immediate ruin. The paper trembled once, then steadied as she tightened her grip. "I do not seek your hand from charity nor from fashion. I seek it because accounts long obscured have now been examined, and because what was taken under your father's roof will be returned under your name." A murmur moved through the guests, thin and shocked. Mrs. Dalrymple turned sharply toward Mrs. Erikson, then looked away fast enough to deny she had done it. Eloise shifted in her chair, rings clicking against glass. Margot's lips parted. Mrs. Erikson's smile narrowed. "Your Grace," she said lightly, "you cannot mean this serious tone to be directed at household bookkeeping. Families endure private adjustments. The girl has been fed, clothed, and instructed beyond her station. If she has encouraged delusion in you, I accept blame for too much lenience." Susan felt the old heat of shame rise from collar to cheek. She kept her eyes on the page. The Duke took 3 measured strides onto the carpet. Wet from his coat darkened the pale weave where he passed. Guests moved aside without being asked. He stopped close enough that Susan could smell rain and cold wool above the perfume-heavy room. "Read," he said. His voice remained level. No anger raised it. No softness reduced it. She read. "I have seen certified copies of shipping ledgers altered after Mr. Erikson's final illness. I have reviewed witness statements regarding coercion, concealment, and unlawful transfer." Her breath caught on the final word. Transfer. The legal term was exact. Not rumour, not gossip, proof. She had copied those words in other cases for men who lost properties they had believed untouchable. Hearing them applied to her own house felt like standing on a stair that suddenly ended one step early. Mrs. Erikson made a small dismissive gesture toward the room. Forged papers travel quickly when ambitious men require entertainment. "Susan, you will stop this performance at once." Susan looked up because the use of her given name in that tone always preceded punishment. The Duke was already watching Mrs. Erikson, not with outrage, but with an attention so cold it made outrage look theatrical. "She will finish," he said. No one spoke for a long beat. Fire settled in the grate with a soft collapse of cinders. Outside, a carriage rolled past over wet stone, wheels hissing. Susan returned to the letter because it was easier to face ink than faces. "If you consent, the petition for restoration shall be filed at dawn. Temporary management orders have been prepared. Residence rights will be secured in your person pending final judgment." She reached the next line and stopped, not from modesty but from disbelief so sharp it stole articulation. The script blurred. She blinked once, hard. "Read it aloud," the Duke said. She did not know whether he meant to compel her or steady her. Perhaps both. She forced the words through a throat gone tight. "I ask for marriage because in the present law it is the swiftest shield available to place beyond challenge what should never have been at hazard." Mrs. Erikson gave a short laugh, louder than before. "A shield! How poetic! Hear him, ladies. A duke rescuing a governess from her own imagination." She turned to Susan with that public smile sharpened for private damage. "You have overreached, girl. Fold the paper. Apologise to His Grace for your deceit, and I may permit you to remain in this house as companion to your sisters after all." Eloise looked relieved at the cruelty, as if familiar scripts promised survival. Margot smirked, emboldened. Do apologise, Susan. You are paling. It does not suit you. Susan's vision narrowed at the edges. She was conscious of the damp seam of her cuff against her wrist, of the ache in both heels, of hunger twisting low under her ribs with near mathematical persistence. Maximum vulnerability had become her customary state, but never before had it been witnessed by a man with power enough to alter outcomes. She understood the danger in that as clearly as she understood the relief. Powerful men did not intervene without cost. Promises from titled mouths often hid a different ledger on the back page. Yet the letter in her hand spoke in legal precision, not sentimental fog. Dates, orders, filings, transfer of management, language built to survive challenge. She lifted her head. Her voice came hoarse but intelligible. Your Grace, this letter bears your seal and signature. Did you send it? The room drew breath together. One officer glanced toward the door as if calculating whether departure would be noted. The Duke did not look away from her face. I did. Then you intended these terms to be heard. He considered for a fraction, and something altered in his posture, not a retreat, not an advance, simply a recognition that she required directness and would not accept theatre. I intended them to be acted upon, he said. Mrs. Eriksson stepped between them with a rustle of silk and fury. You will not interrogate a duke under my roof. Your roof! Susan heard herself say it before caution could reclaim her tongue. Silence fell hard. She had not raised her voice. She had only sharpened it. Mrs. Eriksson's eyes flashed. Unfilial ingrate! Her hand moved, swift and practised, towards Susan's wrist, aiming for the spot where bruises could be hidden by lace. The Duke caught her arm mid-air. He did not grip hard. He did not need to. The restraint itself, public and undeniable, changed the geometry of the room. You will not touch her, he said. Mrs. Eriksson tried to pull free and failed. This is indecent. No, he said. Indecent is administrative theft dressed as guardianship. He released her wrist and turned slightly, enough to include every guest without raising his volume. If any person here mistakes this for domestic disagreement, let that mistake end now. He looked back at Susan, and in that single shift of attention she felt again the perilous intimacy of being seen accurately. His gaze dropped once, brief and precise, to the faint welt at her cuff where fabric had ridden up during the struggle. His jaw tightened. You are injured, he said, as if naming weather. She almost denied it by reflex. Liar, she thought, hearing the word he had not spoken. She said instead, it is of no consequence. His expression did not change. It is evidence. The word moved through her like cold water and clean air together. Evidence, not weakness, not shame. Documentable fact. She had lived for years inside other people's revisions of events. To hear injury named in legal terms made her knees nearly give, though she remained standing by force of habit and pride. Mrs. Dalrymple rose halfway from her chair, then sat again, unwilling to declare a side until outcomes clarified. Eloise muttered to Margot, too low for full sense, but Susan caught enough. If this becomes scandal, Margot hissed back, do not say anything. The officers stared fixedly at the mantel as if military discipline covered social cowardice. Susan became aware that she was still holding the letter open to the final lines, her thumbs smudging the edge where rain had touched. She should fold it. She should hand it to the Duke. She should leave the room. She did none of those things. Instead, she read the closing sentence because retreat at this point would restore the old order by default. If you consent, I will stand beside you in public before dawn, and every claim attached to your name will be defended by mine until the court has no room left for evasion. Her voice steadied by the final clause. The legal architecture of it gave her footing. Defended by mine. until the court has no room left for evasion. Not romance, strategy, protection articulated as procedure. For the first time since the seal broke, she let herself look directly at him. Rain had dried in thin lines on his greatcoat. A pale scar disappeared beneath his collar near the throat, old and neatly healed. His hands at his sides were still. So still they read as restraint rather than calm. Men accustomed to instant obedience often filled silence with command. He did not. He waited. Mrs. Erickson found her voice in a pitch sharpened by panic. You cannot simply arrive and manufacture authority. This household is under my management by lawful transfer. The Duke extended his hand toward a footman who stood frozen near the door. Portfolio. The footman started, then hurried forward with a leather case that had been brought in from the hall and left unopened in the confusion. The Duke set it on the tea-table, unfastened the strap, and removed 3 folded documents tied in blue ribbon. He did not present them yet. He let the rooms see their seals. Magistrate, auditor, chancery clerk. Lawful transfer has already been challenged, he said. Interim orders have been signed this afternoon, effective immediately pending hearing. Mrs. Erickson's colour shifted beneath powder. By whose petition? Mine and Miss Erickson's by proxy authority under attached affidavit. Susan stared at him, startled enough that her lips parted without sound. Proxy authority. He had acted before asking because delay would have favoured the current possessor. It was ruthless. It was also, in strict legal logic, correct. She felt anger flicker with gratitude, then fold into a more complicated awareness that this man had moved pieces across a board she had been forced to play blind for years. You had no right, Mrs. Erickson said. The Duke's eyes remained on Susan. I had standing, he replied. Then, at last, he turned to the room and spoke with the clipped finality of verdict. No one interrupts her again. Silence held for one hard breath after his command, and then the drawing-room lost its balance. A gust came through the half-open door from the hall. Rain and cold air moved over candle flames, bending them low. Somewhere beyond the threshold a child coughed, a thin sound at first, then a rougher one that caught and repeated. Heads turned with visible relief, grateful for any disruption that was not legal ruin. A nursemaid appeared with a small boy in a dark velvet coat, his curls damp from the weather, one glove missing. He was perhaps 7. His cheeks were too pale for a child brought in from the cold, and his chest lifted in short, quick pulls. The maid curtsied badly from haste. Forgive us, Your Grace, she said, breathless. The carriage wheel caught at Hanover Turn. Master Julian would not remain at Vale House. The Duke's face did not alter, yet Susan saw the shift. Attention sharpened, not panic, not softness, something more controlled and therefore more revealing. He crossed half the distance to the child, then stopped, as if habit had put a hand against his chest. The boy tried to answer for himself and failed, another cough breaking the sentence into fragments. Mrs. Erickson recovered her smile and moved first, silk whispering over carpet. Poor little gentleman, all this rain. Bring him close to the fire. Eloise, move that stool. Margot, ring for sweet milk. We shall have him comfortable at once. Comfort in that room meant heat, perfume, and constraint. Susan watched the nurse settle the child near the hearth, where lavender scent from 3 different ladies hung thick in the air. Julian's cough deepened at once. He pressed his fist to his sternum and tried to draw breath around the tight knot of his cravat. His eyes watered. No one else seemed to notice the pattern. They heard noise. She heard effort. Her father had sounded like that in his final winter when rooms were close and smoke sat low. She had learned then what helped and what harmed. Loosen the throat, lift the shoulders, open cold air in measured draughts, Steam with lavender if lungs were narrow, not drowning, and never while fabric pinched at the neck. "Do not crowd him," she said, already stepping forward. Mrs. Erikson turned, disbelief bright with fury. "Stand where you belong." The child coughed again, harder, his small body folded with it. The nurse looked to the Duke, uncertain whether rank permitted action. Footmen remained still at the walls, trained to await a direct command. Susan did not wait. She set the proposal letter on the nearest table, dropped to her knees on the bare boards before the hearth, and reached for Julian's cravat knot. Mrs. Erikson's voice cut sharply behind her. "You will not touch noble blood with those hands." Susan did not look up. Then someone else must loosen this now. No one moved. The Duke spoke from her left, low and absolute. "Do as she says." The knot came free under Susan's fingers. The boy dragged in a breath that still caught halfway. She slid one hand between his shoulder blades and one at his wrist, counting his pulse with the same exact patience she used on legal lines. Too fast, not failing, frightened and constricted. She looked to the nursemaid. "Has he had fever?" "No, miss. Only these spells when the weather shifts." "Any blood?" The maid blanched. "Never." "Good." Susan exhaled once, steadying herself, then looked toward the hall. "Open that window by 2 inches. Not more." One footman hesitated. Mrs. Erikson snapped, "You take orders from me in this house?" The Duke did not raise his voice. "You take orders from Miss Erikson." The footman obeyed at once. Cold night air slid into the overheated room. Candle flames shivered. Julian's breathing stayed rapid but less jagged. Susan loosened the top button of his coat, then lifted his chin with careful fingers. "Master Julian, look at me." His gaze found her with the desperate obedience of children who cannot spare energy for pride. "You will copy my breathing. In through your nose for 3 counts. Hold 1. Out through your mouth for 3. We do it together." He tried and coughed. She did not correct him with urgency. She set the rhythm again, calm and unbroken. "In, 2, 3, hold out, 2, 3. By the 3rd attempt, the cough separated into intervals rather than one continuous assault. The nurse knelt opposite, tears bright with fear and restraint. Susan glanced at her. "Hot water, not boiling, lavender from the still room, 2 drops only, and a clean cloth." "I will fetch it," the maid said, half rising. Margot gave a brittle laugh from behind her fan. "How admirable! Our household drudge now prescribes treatment to dukes." Susan did not turn her head. "If you wish to help, Lady Margot, move farther from the fire. He needs cooler air." The room made a quiet sound at that. Not quite a gasp, but close. Margot flushed dark and stepped back anyway, because disobeying would now be visible as cruelty to a child. Eloise moved with her, expression pinched. The mantel clock struck 9:30, each note falling through the room like a tally entered in a ledger. With each strike, Julian's shoulders lowered a fraction. Susan kept count at his wrist until the pulse settled from frantic to merely quick. She rubbed his back in slow circles through velvet, then took the missing glove from the nurse and wrapped his fingers to warm them without tightening grip. The maid returned with the basin and cloth. Susan tested the steam against her own wrist, added lavender and held the cloth near, not over Julian's nose and mouth. "Small breaths," she told him. "You are safe. There is no hurry." He obeyed. After 6 breaths, the cough thinned to a single rough sound. After 10, his chest rose without catching. Colour returned to his cheeks in a fragile wash. Susan did not permit herself relief yet. She had seen false recoveries. She waited, counted another minute, then 2, hand steady on his shoulder. Only then did she rise from her knees. The room remained suspended in an unnatural stillness. Mrs. Dalrymple stared at Susan, as if she had begun speaking Greek in a parish church. One officer cleared his throat and looked away at once. The second watched Julian with frank concern and no skill for hiding it. Mrs. Erikson's mouth held a shape that could not decide between outrage and calculation. Julian leaned towards Susan's skirt, exhausted, and caught her sleeve with 2 fingers. "Do not go," he whispered, voice scraped thin. She crouched again so she did not tower over him. "I am here." The Duke had not moved during any of it. He stood near the tea table, one hand resting on the leather portfolio, gaze fixed on Susan with that same austere concentration that made most men appear theatrical by comparison. She became suddenly aware of her posture, of soot on her cuff from the hearth, of damp hair loosening at her neck. She had forgotten the audience while the child struggled. Now she felt every eye return. Mrs. Erikson made her choice. She stepped forward, hands clasped, in a gesture of injured propriety. "Your Grace, this display has gone far enough. The boy required his nurse, not improvisation from an emotionally unstable girl seeking notice. If he worsens, the responsibility is hers." The nursemaid gave a strangled sound, fear and indignation colliding. Susan rose to answer, then stopped. Anger would serve Mrs. Erikson. Precision would not. "He worsened at the fire," Susan said. "He improved in cooler air with loosened cloth and paced breathing. If he has these spells, he should not be brought into overheated rooms with strong scent and tight collars. He requires a physician's regimen kept consistently, not only when he is visibly distressed." Mrs. Erikson's laugh was short and sharp, and now she lectures on medical discipline as well as law. Susan held her gaze. "No, I am describing what just occurred in front of 12 witnesses." The words landed clean. Not accusation, record. The Duke spoke to the nursemaid, not to the room. "Name? Anne Porter, Your Grace. Was this his usual pattern?" "Yes, Your Grace. In London smoke and in crowded rooms, Dr. Haviland advised open air and measured breathing. Begging your pardon, I could not reach him through the ladies." No one mistook the meaning. Several ladies looked at their gloves. Mrs. Dalrymple adjusted her fan without opening it. Mrs. Erikson's voice thinned. "My drawing-room is not a hospital ward, and I will not have servants inventing faults to excuse disorder." Susan saw Anne Porter flinch. Dismissal could destroy a woman with dependents in 2 days. The easiest path now would be silence. Let the Duke defend his own staff. Let injustice choose someone else for once. Susan knew that temptation and despised it. "Anne Porter acted correctly," Susan said. "The delay came from social hesitation, not negligence." The nurse stared at her, startled by the defence. The Duke turned his head slightly towards Susan. "You are certain?" "I am." "On what basis?" She met his eyes. "Observation and prior experience with chronic winter lungs." "My father suffered similar constriction." A faint line deepened beside his mouth. Not quite a smile. Recognition, perhaps, of method answered with method. He looked back to Anne Porter. "You remain in post. Double coal for the nursery and upper corridor. No heavy scent near the child. Cravats loose until Dr. Haviland reviews him tomorrow morning." "Yes, Your Grace." He shifted to the footman at the window. "Keep it opened this width." Then, after a brief pause that drew every ear, he addressed Susan directly. "Thank you." The simplicity of it struck harder than any elaborate praise could have done. She inclined her head, because anything else would expose too much. "It was necessary." Julian tugged her sleeve again. "Will you read?" Mrs. Erikson made a disbelieving sound. "Read? After this spectacle?" The boy's lower lip trembled with fatigue, and Susan answered him, before anyone else could weaponize the request. "If your Grace permits." The Duke's reply was immediate. "Read." She looked toward the side table where the proposal letter lay beside the magistrate's seals and the untouched tea. The page she had opened still waited at the final lines, ink dark against cream. Reading it now would turn private legal intent into witnessed fact, with a child at her knee and half London society as unwilling clerk. She understood the danger. She also understood the utility. Written language became hardest to erase once enough mouths had heard it. She lifted the paper and resumed in a voice pitched lower for Julian, though every adult in the room listened. I ask for marriage because in the present law it is the swiftest shield available to place beyond challenge what should never have been at hazard. Julian's breathing stayed steady against her arm. She continued, If you consent, the petition for restoration shall be filed at dawn. Temporary management orders have been prepared. Residence rights will be secured in your person pending final judgment. Mrs. Dalrymple closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing against rain. One of the officers set his untouched glass aside and stood straighter, the posture of a man hearing formal dispatch. Susan read the final line without haste. If you consent, I will stand beside you in public before dawn, and every claim attached to your name will be defended by mine until the court has no room left for evasion. When she lowered the letter, no one spoke. The fire gave a soft pop. Rain moved in sheets against the window. Julian leaned against her hip, already half asleep from exhaustion and relief. Susan handed the page back to the Duke with both hands, keeping edges clean, as she had been taught. He accepted it, but did not look down. His attention remained on her face, searching not for gratitude, but for assent. Behind them, Mrs. Erikson drew breath to speak, and this time the sound carried less authority than fear. Your Grace, whatever grievances this girl has fed you, she is not fit for such an arrangement. She is unpresentable, disobedient, and given to melodrama. I have managed this house for years, under strain no one here comprehends. Susan felt old shame try to rise and fail, blocked by a steadier force that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with record. She did not answer the insult. She turned instead to Anne Porter. Take Master Julian to the blue morning room for cooler air. Keep him upright for 10 minutes, then bed. Send for Dr. Haviland at first light, even if he sleeps well. Write down the hour of this episode and its duration. Anne nodded quickly. Yes, miss. Not miss, the Duke said, still looking at Susan. Miss Erikson. The correction was slight. The room heard it as decree. Anne curtsied to Susan with new care, lifted Julian and carried him toward the door. The boy opened his eyes once, found Susan again, and gave a faint nod, as if sealing a compact between equals of different ages, who had both learned what rooms could do to breathing. Then he was gone into the corridor's dim light, nurse beside him, footman closing the door softly behind. The drawing-room stood rearranged around that absence. Candles burned lower. Perfume had thinned in the opened air. No one sat where they had first chosen. Status had not vanished, but its edges had shifted. The Duke set the folded proposal beside the blue ribbon documents and placed his gloved hand over all three, paper beneath leather, legal force made visible. Now, he said, and his voice carried to every corner, we proceed. No one asked what he meant. He had spoken as men spoke before verdicts, and the room, trained by rank and fear, obeyed the shape of that tone before it obeyed content. Susan remained beside the tea-table, hands empty now, pulse still not fully settled from Julian's coughing fit. The Duke removed his glove finger by finger and set both gloves next to the folded proposal, as if he intended to touch each page himself and leave no space for dispute about handling, sequence, or seal. He untied the blue ribbon. Mrs. Dalrymple, he said, not looking up, You value propriety. Stand witness to process." Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated only a breath, then rose. "If process is what we are doing, Your Grace, I can read a seal." "Good." He laid the first paper open on the tea-table and turned it so the candles struck wax and signature. A magistrate's crest, a date, the afternoon's filing mark in dark ink, still fresh enough to reflect light. Susan knew the form at once. Interim Protective Order for Estate Management, pending full hearing. She had copied near-identical language for strangers, and never imagined she would see her own name where the vulnerable party was listed. Mrs. Eriksson made a brittle sound. "I have not been served." "You have now," the Duke said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sentence struck with the calm of iron placed on stone. He opened the second document. "Auditors accounting commissioned under Chancery authority. Preliminary findings only. Final schedule to follow after ledger seizure." He looked to the two officers by the mantel, who had straightened without being told. "Gentlemen, you will witness transfer of household keys and document chest to neutral custody." One officer bowed his head. "At once, Your Grace." The other glanced toward Mrs. Eriksson, then back to the paper. "By your leave, do we require a constable present for a signature?" "Already waiting in the hall." That shifted the room again. Susan had not heard the door, but of course she had been listening to breath and pulse, not boots. He had not arrived in outrage and hope. He had arrived with sequence, authority, and contingencies already in place. Mrs. Eriksson took a step forward, lavender silk bright in the candlelight, fury finally stripping polish from her voice. "You stage this in my drawing-room as if we are criminals." The Duke lifted the third paper. "Not as if." He placed it flat and tapped the lower margin once. "Statement from former clerk Thomas Bell regarding post-illness alterations to Eriksson shipping ledgers." Then his gaze moved to Susan for the briefest moment. "Corroborated by copied exemplars in Miss Eriksson's hand." Her throat tightened, not from fear this time, from the shock of hearing her hidden labour named in public without contempt attached to it. Mrs. Eriksson turned so sharply her skirt struck the tea-table leg. "She has forged for coin, then. You hear him. She traffics in papers at night." Susan could have denied the coins. She could have denied the nights. Denial had kept her safe before. But tonight truth had standing. "I copied legal notices," she said. "Never forged. Your own solicitors can compare stroke pressure, spacing and correction marks if they wish accuracy instead of theatre." Eloise gave a short laugh that cracked at the edges. "Listen to her, a scholar from the attic." Margot added, "Your Grace, she is dramatic when cornered." The Duke turned his head toward them, with visible patience exhausted. "Enough!" Just that. One word. Both sisters fell silent, colour high in their cheeks. The mantel clock marked another minute. The rain pressed harder against the windows, then eased, then returned. Susan felt the wet hem of her skirt cooling around her ankles, where the fire no longer reached. Her body had begun to shake in small intervals she could not fully suppress. Exhaustion, hunger, cold, and the abrupt release after danger. She recognized the pattern and despised that others might see it. The Duke saw it anyway. He did not comment at once. He reached to the sideboard, took a clean porcelain plate from the stack set for guests, and placed on it 2 pieces of bread, cold roast, and a small wedge of cheese from the untouched supper tray. The movement was precise, unhurried, impossible to misread. He set the plate in front of Susan beside the legal papers. "Eat," he said. Heat rose to her face faster than any flame could have caused. "Your Grace, this is not the moment." "It is exactly the moment." She stared at the plate as if it were another document requiring signature. "I am well!" His jaw tightened by a fraction. "Liar!" The word was quiet, soft almost, sharper than shouting. He inclined his head toward her hands. "Your fingers are trembling. You are cold through. You have been standing since before I arrived, and you have not eaten since morning." The room went very still. Mrs. Erikson gave a contemptuous laugh, too fast, too loud. "He reads tremors. Now how poetic!" The Duke did not look at her. "Well, I read evidence." Then, finally, he looked directly at Susan. "By noon yesterday my man saw you leave Bell's chambers with ink on both cuffs and no parcel. Today at Bond Street you stood in sleet outside Vival's window 53 minutes, carrying 2 hat boxes, while your stepmother remained dry." His voice didn't change. "You limped on the return coach. You gave your crust to the scullery maid's brother at the back step. You entered this room light-headed and still set every cup in order." Susan forgot to breathe for one suspended beat. He had been watching. Not tonight alone. Not in general rumour. In particulars small enough to prove attention and careful enough to feel like trespass. Shame flared first, the old instinct to hide deprivation before it could be used against her. Then a second feeling rose beneath it, stranger and more dangerous. Relief so sudden it almost hurt. Someone had seen the humiliations exactly, and had not looked away. "Why?" she asked before caution returned. It came out as a whisper she had not intended to release. His expression remained carved from restraint, "because men were stealing your life in ledgers and no court trusts abstractions. I required facts no one could dismiss." He held her gaze another second. "And because you were enduring what no one should." The last clause entered her like a blade wrapped in velvet. It was not tenderness in the ordinary form. It was judgment, and not on her. She sat because her knees had begun to weaken and she would not collapse in front of this room. She took a bite of bread to stop the shaking and to deny Mrs. Erikson the spectacle of refusal. The food was plain, cold, and almost painfully welcome. She chewed once, twice, swallowed carefully. Her stomach tightened in protest, then eased. Mrs. Dalrymple watched this in silence, fan closed in both hands. By the time Susan had taken a second bite, the constable entered from the hall with rein on his shoulders and removed hat in hand. He stopped at the threshold, bowed to the Duke, then to the assembled company with bureaucratic neutrality. "Constable Renshaw, Hanover Division, present as requested." The Duke gestured to the papers. "You will witness service and inventory transfer." Renshaw stepped forward, eyes moving quickly over seals and signatures. "Order appears regular. I will require acknowledgement from current manager." "Mrs. Erikson," the Duke said. "Sign." She did not move. "I refuse." "Noted," said the constable, already writing. "Refusal does not suspend interim order." The Duke lifted the keyring from the side table where it lay beside the tea-caddy. Heavy brass keys clinking against each other like small iron bells. "Household keys." Mrs. Erikson reached for them. "Those are mine." He drew his hand back before she touched metal. "They are attached to property under challenge." He turned to Susan. "Miss Erikson, stand." She rose, plate still in one hand, startled by the command and by the instinctive way she obeyed it. He placed the keys in her free palm and closed her fingers around the ring, his gloveless hand warm and steady over her cold knuckles, for one brief second. "Custodial possession pending hearing," he said clearly, for constable and guests alike. The contact ended, the imprint remained. Renshaw wrote again. "Recorded." Eloise made a small, strangled sound. Margot whispered, "This is ruin!" Not quietly enough. Mrs. Erikson's face had gone nearly grey beneath powder. You cannot hand authority to a girl who has never managed a proper table, let alone an estate." Susan felt the weight of the keys drag at her wrist. Metal, proof, obligation, not triumph. Not yet. She set the plate down before speaking, because crumbs on legal paper would be an insult she would not permit herself. "I can read accounts," she said. "I can keep inventory. I can pay wages on time when funds exist and record deficits when they do not. I can distinguish debt from theft." Her voice steadied as she continued. "If there are duties I do not yet know, I will learn them." The Duke's mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The smallest acknowledgement of precise language recognised and respected. Mrs. Ericsson tried once more, desperation now naked. "Your Grace, you would bind your name to scandal and a penniless girl because she plays at competence." He answered without looking away from Susan. "No, I would bind my name to fact." Then he added, and the room understood that this line could never be withdrawn, "The proposal stands, publicly, irrevocably." Candlelight seemed to sharpen around edges of glass and silver. Even the rain sounded farther away for a moment, as if the house itself had paused to hear. Susan's heart struck hard against her ribs. She had read those words. She had known what they meant in law. Hearing him declare them aloud before witnesses transformed document into fate. There would be no private retreat after tonight, no polite correction that a misunderstanding had occurred. He had staked title, reputation, and legal strategy on a woman the room still considered disposable. The constable cleared his throat softly, professional to the core. "For my record, Your Grace, do you require immediate relocation of Mrs. Ericsson and household dependents?" "Not into weather at this hour," the Duke said. "They remain in East Wing chambers under notice until morning coach. Access restricted to personal effects only. No document removal. 2 officers at the archive room door through the night." Both officers answered together. "Yes, Your Grace." Every external thread tightened into procedure. No dramatics left to hide behind. Mrs. Ericsson swayed once, recovered, and drew herself upright with the final dignity of someone who had ruled by intimidation and now possessed only posture. "This is not finished." "No," said Susan, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. "It is not." She turned to the constable. "I request inventory of the study cabinets before midnight and seal on my father's remaining desk if still present." Renshaw nodded. "Request entered." The Duke looked at her then with an intensity that felt like standing close to a storm front. "You will not conduct that inventory alone." "I have done everything alone for years." "Not tonight." The command came low, stripped of ornament, and she heard what sat beneath it. Not control for its own sake. Protection offered in the only grammar he trusted. She held his gaze. "Very well, Mrs. Davies should attend. She knows what was moved and when." "Agreed." One of the officers went at once to fetch the housekeeper. Within minutes, Mrs. Davies appeared at the door, apron hastily changed for a dark wool dress, eyes red-rimmed but alert. She took in the constable, the papers, the keys in Susan's hand, and something like fierce relief passed over her face before discipline returned. "You sent for me, miss?" Susan almost corrected the title by habit, then let it stand. "Yes, we begin cabinet inventory now." Mrs. Davies nodded once. "I have wax, twine, and the old tally book." The Duke gathered the 3 documents, refolded them with care, and placed them back into the portfolio. He left the proposal letter on the table, separate from the rest, as if acknowledging that law and vow were linked but not identical. When he straightened, he remained still for so long the silence deepened around him. He did not move to leave. He did not reclaim distance. He simply stood at Susan's shoulder, broad and immovable, while she tucked the heavy key ring into her pocket and steadied her breath for the work ahead. He had commanded armies, they said. Rooms, too. Men with inherited power rarely knew how to stay when no applause remained. Yet he stood there in wet coat and fading candlelight, refusing to step away from the narrow space where she shook, ate, and chose her words. "Miss Erickson," he said at last, so only she and those nearest could hear, "from this hour no one in this house speaks over you." The sentence settled into her bones with the weight of a lock turning. She lifted her chin, keys against her hip, rain sounding steady beyond the glass, and answered in a voice that did not tremble. "Then let us begin with the ledgers." Mrs. Davies did not waste a step. She led them through the side passage to the old study, skirts lifted clear of stair dust, wax and twine in one hand, the tally book in the other. The room smelled of cold ash, leather, and long neglect. Susan had not crossed that threshold in daylight since her father's funeral. The globe in the corner still leaned on its broken axis. 2 portrait hooks stood empty where her grandparents had once watched over shipping charts. Constable Renshaw set his ledger on the desk and said, "Inventory begins at 10:42. Present parties will state name and role." Each name was entered. No one could later claim confusion. The Duke stood near the door, broad shoulders filling the frame, while the 2 officers took position at the cabinet wall. Mrs. Davies unlocked the first cupboard under Susan's direction, then passed the key to Renshaw for chain of custody. Inside lay household books, stacked by year, invoices tied with faded tape, and a cash tin too light to be honest. Susan lifted each bundle with dry, steady fingers and read labels aloud. Coal accounts, wine allocations, repair receipts. She paused at one ledger where an original line had been scraped and overwritten. Even under weak candlelight she could see the disturbance in the paper grain. "Alteration," she said. Renshaw wrote the word and underlined it once. By 11 o'clock the archive table held 3 neat piles: routine household costs, suspect entries, and personal correspondence to be reviewed under warrant. Eloise appeared at the study door in a travelling cloak she had not yet been permitted to wear, eyes bright with resentment. "Mother says those letters are private." The Duke did not turn. "Then your mother may assert privilege in court." Eloise looked to Susan as if expecting apology and found none. Margot hovered behind her, lips pressed thin, and gave Susan a long, assessing stare that had always promised mockery. Tonight it promised calculation. She said nothing at all. Susan noted the silence as she would note a missing figure in an account, relevant, unexplained. The second cabinet yielded the old rosewood writing box Margot had claimed years ago. Its brass key was tied with blue thread to the handle, recent and hurried. Susan opened it under witness and found not jewellery, but folded shipping abstracts, 2 bearer bonds, and the corner of her father's missing valise liner with his office stamp still visible. Her breath caught once, then settled. "These are his," she said, "removed without entry." Mrs. Davies made a low sound that might have been prayer. Renshaw sealed the contents in waxed packet number 7 and pressed the constabulary stamp while all present watched. Nothing vanished now unless the whole room agreed to lie. When the mantel clock in the corridor struck midnight, Dr. Haviland arrived from Grosvenor Street with rain on his hat brim and impatience in his hands. Susan met him in the blue morning room where Julian slept, propped on pillows, breath even, lashes damp from earlier strain. Anne Porter stood sentinel by the hearth with the chart Susan had ordered: hour of onset, duration, response to cooler air, pulse count. The physician reviewed it, examined the child, and nodded once. Who loosened the collar and paced him? Anne pointed to Susan. Dr. Haviland looked at her properly then. Correct intervention. Continue this regimen. No heavy scents near him. He wrote the directive, signed it, and handed the page to the Duke. External doubt closed. Medical record opened. In the drawing-room, service of summons resumed with the cold efficiency of dawn work done too late at night. Mrs. Ericsson signed at last, each stroke hard enough to score the paper. "I sign under protest," she said. "Recorded," said Renshaw. Mrs. Dalrymple requested permission to add a witness note. Every head turned. She stood, fan closed, voice clipped by embarrassment. 3 winters ago, I attended dinner here and heard Mr. Ericsson ask for his red ledger. Mrs. Ericsson told him it had been burned by mistake. I believed her then. I do not now. She signed below the constable's line, then met Susan's eyes briefly with an expression nearer to contrition than kindness. It was not warmth, it was still useful. An hour before dawn, the east wing trunks were brought down one by one. Officers inspected each under lamplight. Silk gowns passed. Jewellery listed on personal schedule passed. A packet of estate receipts hidden in Eloise's mantle lining did not pass. She burst into tears and swore she had never seen them. Margot went pale and said very quietly, "Mother told us papers were ours, if they fit in a sleeve." No one answered. The line sat in the hall like smoke no window could clear. Mrs. Ericsson drew herself upright, face rigid, and was escorted to the waiting coach with her daughters and 2 maids. She did not look back at the house. The rain had thinned to mist when Susan climbed to the attic before sunrise and pried loose the brick beside her narrow bed. The waxed cloth packet remained where she had hidden it, coins and all, untouched by any hand but hers. She carried it downstairs and placed it on the study desk beside sealed evidence packet 7. "Personal earnings from legal copywork," she said to Renshaw, "declared for record and tax." He counted in her presence and entered the amount. Nothing of hers would again be called theft because it had once been secret. In the same hour, Mrs. Davies produced the old tally book and confirmed missed wages for 2 dismissed servants. Susan ordered immediate payment from recovered household cash tin, witnessed and signed. At first light, Mr. Bell himself arrived, summoned overnight by the Duke's courier, with Thomas Bell's statement copy and 2 damaged exemplars he had preserved against challenge. He bowed to Susan as one professional to another, not as master to dependent. "Your spacing saved this case," he said quietly, placing the pages with the magistrate packet. She felt the words in the same place Hunger had lived for years and did not trust herself to answer more than, "Thank you, sir." The Duke watched that exchange in silence, scar at his throat pale in the morning grey, his stillness the only indulgence he allowed himself. By the 2nd hour after sunrise they stood in the magistrate chamber, all damp wool and ink smell, as interim custody converted to formal restoration, pending final hearing. Susan signed her full name without blot. The clerk sanded the line and passed her the petition for marital consent attached to property shield provisions. She read every clause. No dowry claim against her person. Independent control of recovered estate revenue. Right to refuse sale of her father's office holdings until judgment. She looked up at the Duke. "You left me an exit." "I left you choice," he said. "Say no, and I still prosecute." The crux of him revealed itself there, hard and spare and unexpectedly clean. At noon the chapel held only 6 witnesses. Mrs. Davies, Anne Porter with Julian beside her in a looser cravat, Mr. Bell, Constable Renshaw in formal coat, and Dr. Haviland delayed but present at the back pew. No flowers dressed the aisle, no musicians softened the air. Susan wore a plain cream gown from the house chest, altered in haste, dark hair pinned with her mother's recovered pearl comb that Mrs. Davies had found wrapped in linen at the bottom of packet 7. When the vicar asked for consent, her voice carried clear to the stone apse. "I do." The Duke answered in the same measured tone he had used for orders and legal declarations, and somehow that made it more solemn, not less. After signatures, Julian approached Susan with grave ceremony and offered a small object from his pocket, the missing glove button that had torn during his coughing spell. "For luck," he said. She took it as if it were silver and tucked it into her reticule. Anne Porter smiled then, brief and tired. Not quite relief. The first edge of it. Outside, the mist lifted enough to show the street in full. No crowd waited. No applause came. The work ahead remained substantial. Hearings, audits, repairs, wages, names restored in ledgers, line by line. Yet each unresolved thread from the night had a place now, entered, sealed, witnessed or spoken aloud where denial could not easily reach. That evening, back in the same drawing room where she had been ordered to perform, Susan stood beside the tea table and reviewed the final inventory with Mrs. Davies, while the Duke remained by the window, reading Doctor. Haviland's regimen for Julian, and adding his own hand beneath it, so no servant could claim ambiguity. The proposal letter, dried and flattened, lay in a document case marked Personal Covenant. The magistrate order and auditor's accounting were filed in the study safe under dual key, one in Susan's keeping, one in the Duke's. The rosewood box sat empty except for a note in Susan's hand. Contents transferred to record this date, witnessed. When she finished the last entry, she looked up. He crossed the room in 3 unhurried strides and stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him in the cooling air. "From this day," he said, voice low, "no one takes your name out of your own house again." She closed the ledger, set her palm over the cover and answered, "Then we keep the books honest, Your Grace." And they did.